So we have just imported our scan. One of the first things I like to do is typically magnify this a little bit. If I'm doing planning software, you can leave all four quadrants up if you wish to have the 3D reconstruction. Another one that's useful as well is to do something like this if you really want to focus on the coronal. But for the purposes of this demonstration, we'll kind of leave it with the four quadrants there. And now that we've magnified that a bit, you can scroll through the images in a couple different ways. One of the easiest ways is to put the cursor on the crosshairs of the axial, and then if you want to bring it forward and say, we want to look at the anatomy here, and a lot of times I like to go from forward or anterior to posterior. And we can, let's say we want to look at the patient's left-sided anatomy. Now I've got the cursor kind of right in the sweet spot here between the middle turbinate and the orbit, so that on the sagittal I can appreciate all that anatomy. And then we can just kind of scroll backwards and forwards and look at that anatomy. On the left, if we want to look at the right side, we come over and we got a good view on the sag now. We're kind of in the sweet spot here. We're not too far over in the orbit or too far medially. But let's take a look at the left-sided anatomy kind of for planning purposes here. So the other way you can scroll through is you can use these arrows and go forward and backward. You can also use your roller ball, which I have here, and I'm just going forward and backward on the coronal. So any of those, it's really up to you as to which you prefer. So we just talked about the frontal recess anatomy. So on the left side, let's take a look here, at least initially, at the anatomy. And you're going to see that we got a stack of cells here. A lot of times I like to try to find the agar nazi right off the bat. And you can see that as we look at that, and we look on both the sagittal, you see the agar right there, you see it here, right next to the nasolacrimal. Now the building blocks are very useful for understanding the anatomy, and there's a few different ways of doing that. So I'm going to click on planning object. We're going to click the building blocks here, the plus sign. So now I can put in a building block right there where the agar nazi is. And you have some options. You can label them as you go. So if I want to label it as I go, then I can click on the planning object and the tool right there, and then agar nazi, and then that's already identified for us right there. And then if I want to put in another object just above that, this is going to be that supra-agar cell. Then you can go here to the tools. It's the supra-agar cell. It's already kind of pre-labeled. You can also, if you are becoming pretty facile with this, you can put all of these cells in at the same time. So I'm going to put in that one, that's the bulla, and then there's a cell up above it. It's going to be a suprabullar cell. Now you can see that some of these cells don't quite line up perfectly because human anatomy is not exactly a building block. So I'm going to tuck that corner down a little bit. I'm going to look at this one and say, oh, that one probably should be shortened a little bit in that direction and maybe lengthened just a hair in that direction. Now we haven't labeled these posterior cells, so we can go to this function here. This is the cell that we had labeled as the bulla. And then we go to this one. This is the suprabullar cell. And you can close it out and take a look at your anatomy. And you can see on the sagittal, you've got it here. These are your anterior cells and the posterior cells. And then as you kind of scroll backwards and then forward, you see there's the posterior cells. And now we can start to see that we're going to run into these anterior cells coming in. There's agar nazi and supra-agar cell. Now, the next thing that's really nice to draw out is the drainage pathway and the frontal drainage pathway. So you're going to find a way that you prefer to do this. I kind of like to do it at least on the sagittal initially, and then bring it out anteriorly and inferiorly towards the nostril, because this is the way we're going to approach this frontal drainage pathway surgically. Whether you use balloon or curette or shaver or any instrument that you choose, we're going to start here inferiorly and anteriorly and work our way up into the frontal drainage pathway. Now, once you're on the drainage pathway, there's a few different options. One is you can use the bar to drag it from superior to inferior, because we just threw that in and we're going to have to adjust it. You can come over on the coronal and look at it as well, or you can simply put the cursor over it and use the roller ball. And so if we look at the sagittal, I think that's done fairly well as far as being posterior to the auger and the supraauger and being in front of the bulla and the suprabullar cell. But we drew that on the sag, and we really haven't had a chance yet to look at it on the coronal here. So let's take a look at it on the coronal, and I'm going to click on this icon to hide the labels, because now I know what these cells are. I just want to focus on the drainage pathway. And so if we start up superiorly, and I'm going to look at how that pathway comes down, and you see it going through the uncinate there a little bit, but we're doing a pretty good job. We're staying medial to the auger and the supraauger. And then as we follow the drainage pathway down, it kind of comes through the middle turbinate a little bit. So that's not actually going to be how we go. And so we're going to adjust those points a little bit, the trajectory a little bit, to make it what we're going to see in real life. And then you can come really from, as we go from front to back, and here I'm going to go from superior to inferior. So if we look at the axial, just to make sure we have drainage pathway, here we're in the frontal, there's no question on all three cuts. And then let's scroll down, and you start to see the purple cell there. And if you're like, well, I'm not quite sure what that one is. Okay, that's the suprabullar cell. And then right there's my supraauger cell. And you see the drainage pathway is posterior to that supraauger cell, right on the back wall. You might even say, well, maybe we should adjust that back just a little bit. And then as we keep going inferiorly, you see that we are just about to, we're in front of the bulla, and there's the auger nasi. And you could say, well, maybe we should be a little bit posterior, a little bit more medial in that regard, and just tweak it that way. And so that we're happy in all three axes. And that looks pretty good to me. And so now we've kind of done a standard plan. If you come over to the 3D anatomy, you can spin this around however you choose. That gives us almost like a sagittal view. And you see the bulla, the suprabullar cell, auger, supraauger, and you can really kind of get a good view of that. Here you see that we're going to be medial to those anterior cells. And if you click on these in the 3D, it jumps right to that structure in all three axes. Let's say we want to go to the suprabullar cell. Right up there is suprabullar, all three axes. It looks great. And so that would be our plan. And at this stage, I would export that plan. Now, if we want to hide the labels again and go to the other side. Okay, so if we want to go to the patient's right-hand side, here you can see we put the cursor in the right auger nasi. And if we want to start adding cells, we can do just like we did on the other side. And then we're going to go to our functions here, and we can put in different labels. Since we've already used auger nasi, I'll call this right auger nasi cell, and we can put a color on that. And then if we want to add another structure, we can come here, and that's going to be the bulla, and we'll kind of size that up. Now we'll go here and we'll make that, let's see what color we make it pink. And then we'll call it right bulla ethmoidalis. And then looks like we've got a suprabullar cell here. And we can make that, any color. We'll call that right suprabullar cell. Okay, so there we go. We can add the labels back in, right auger nasi, right suprabullar, right bulla. We can get rid of the labels for a second because I'm going to draw my frontal drainage pathway. Doing that on the sagittal. And again, you could do it on coronal or any other image that you wish. And then we'll just start down low and see if this right drainage pathway is going where we want it to. Coming all the way up, there it is in the frontal itself, coming down, and it looks like it is headed pretty much in the right trajectory. There it's starting to go through the concha a little bit. So I'm going to pull this over. Now we probably would resect the concha intra-op, so that actually would be where we'd actually would go through the concha. But just to kind of give you an idea of what we're looking at. And then I want to look over here on the sag and make sure that this looks like it's going in the right direction. We're up in the frontal behind that auger and then coming down anteriorly. Now we're not going to make a right angle like that. So we'll kind of just smooth that trajectory out a little bit, something more realistic. And then let's look at it on the axial. If we start all the way up in the frontal sinus itself, we're coming down. You could see the purple is the bulla ethmoidalis, or the suprabular cell actually. Suprabular is the first one that we're going to encounter. And then as we come down, there's the auger nazi, and we're posterior to that. And then there's your bulla ethmoidalis. And you could also say, well, maybe we should move this a little bit medial just to get a little more realistic trajectory. And as we come superiorly and then inferiorly, you see that we're in the right spot, going all the way down. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. All right, so on to the next patient, which is a little more complex anatomy. So we're going to magnify that up again. Let's kind of use our crosshairs. Let's maybe look at the left side and come forward. And we see we have much more complex anatomy with a large cell going up into the frontal here. There's disease, so that makes some of the bony boundaries a little more challenging to identify. But we'll be able to piece together a pretty good plan here, I think. And we'll kind of come over, and there's kind of the sweet spot on the sagittal. So I always, again, like to start anteriorly and try to find the auger nazi. And you can see on the sagittal here that we're right on the beak. It's a little bit tough to see where the auger nazi is. You can see this is the lacrimal coming down. So we know that we're pretty close to that, and we can come a little bit posteriorly and say it's probably right in here. You see that there's a non-diseased cell above it and then a diseased cell here. So I'm going to go ahead and put in an auger nazi right about here. And we will label that auger nazi. And then there's a non-diseased cell on top of it. And you can see that that extends well up into the frontal. So we're going to highlight that, and we're going to kind of draw it back so that it's not quite in the orbit and looks a little bit more anatomically correct. And I would call it a supraauger frontal cell. It does extend way up into the frontal there. And so those are going to be kind of our anterior cells. Then as we look posteriorly here, I'm going to get rid of the labels for just a second. It's so that we can go posteriorly, and we're kind of correlating that with what's going on over here. And we say, well, maybe when we drew this, I should have pulled that down just a little bit more. We know that we're going to have the bulla and those other cells posterior to us here. So it's a little tough to see with the disease, but to me it looks like the face of the bulla should be about right in this trajectory here. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that in, and we will label that for the time being as bulla ethmoidalis. Then you can see that there are some cells above that, and we'll adjust it so that it looks more kind of like regular anatomy. And that is a cell above the bulla, so that's a suprabular cell. And then you still have another cell up here. And so I'll draw that in. And we're going to, again, try to make that anatomically close to what it should be. And then we're going to call that a suprabular frontal cell. Okay, so we can put the labels back in: agar-nazi, supra-agar frontal, then bulla, suprabular, and suprabular frontal. So you can see the anterior cells and the posterior cells. And I'm going to now draw in the frontal drainage pathway, and we'll kind of go right behind those anterior cells and in front of the posterior cells. Now again, that's a rough drawing that I did just on the sagittal. So let's come on over to the coronal, and I like to start up superiorly and see how it starts to go through the supra-agar frontal. And we know that this is attached to the orbit, so the drainage pathway has to come down the medial aspect of that anterior cell. And so we're just kind of conforming that. And you can see that as I click and pull it over, the slider bar is going down as well. Now, as we get into here, it's kind of hard to tell. There may be a concha in this middle turbinate, but it's diseased. It's a little hard to see the exact bony partitions, but that gives you a pretty good idea of where we would want to go. On that coronal, come up medial to the agar, medial to the supra-agar frontal, and then on up into the pathway. And then I'm going to look over on my sagittal here, and we're going to go back posterior to the supra-agar frontal. We're in front of the suprabular frontal cell and the suprabular cell, in front of the bulla, and come on down. And then that trajectory takes a sharp right angle that really is not going to be anatomic with what we're doing. And if we want to get rid of the labels for a second, just so that we can see the pathway as we go on the sagittal. And now let's put the labels back in, and then let's look on the axial. Let's come all the way up top superiorly. We're in the frontal there. There's the supra-agar frontal cell, and you can see that that is attached to the orbit, and it is attached anteriorly. So our drainage pathway is going to be medial and posterior to the supra-agar frontal. This is where the suprabular frontal cell is coming into play, so we should be anterior to that as we go down, and we are. And now there's the suprabular cell. We need to be anterior to that, which we are. And there's the agar-nazi. We are medial and posterior to the agar-nazi, but we're anterior to the bulla. And we're going to track that all the way down. And that looks like a pretty good plan for the patient's left side. So let's take a look at the right side. So we will get rid of that. We can also take a look at it here on the 3D. And you see there, we're posterior to these agar-nazi and supra-agar, anterior to the posterior cells there, and medial to those cells as well, those anterior cells. So in summary, what we've just demonstrated is the use of building block software to aid us in identifying the anatomy of the frontal recess and all of the cells that occupy the frontal drainage pathway. This software is critical so that we can all discuss anatomy and patient cases using the same nomenclature and the same names for each of the various cells. And I really think that this type of software has been essential for improving our understanding of the three-dimensional anatomy of the frontal outflow tract. And this is important regardless of how you choose to do your surgery, whether you use a balloon or hand instruments or shavers or drills. It's critical for all of us to understand where that drainage pathway is and what cells are narrowing that pathway. And then we can choose a variety of surgical instruments to enlarge that pathway and treat complex patient anatomy that we encounter really almost on a daily basis in otolaryngology.